So just as a reminder, my name is Nadia Al-Hashimi, and I'll be presenting this webinar, moderating this webinar. So the National Association of Women MBAs is pleased to present this webinar entitled From Unconscious Bias to Conscious Inclusion, How Women at Work Can Be Allies. We're so grateful to have Stacey Gordon on with us today. Just as a reminder, this webinar will be going for 45 minutes, and then at the end we will have a 15-minute question and answer period. All of you guys are on mute, so if you have any questions, feel free to type it in that chat box. You can send it publicly or you can send it to me privately. I'll address those if you have any immediate issues during the webinar, and at the end I'll field the questions and present them to Stacey in the last 15 minutes of the webinar. So feel free to pose a question at any time during today's presentation, and by simply typing it into the question box on your control panel and then clicking the send button. And at this point, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Stacey Gordon. Stacey is the CEO of Rework Work, which rethinks diversity and reimagines inclusion. Her ideas about leadership and talent are unlike most in that her business philosophy revolves around helping women and professionals of color become visible in their careers. She's worked with Disney, KPMG, LinkedIn, USC, and Pepperdine University, and has been invited to write career and diversity-related articles for Forbes, Essence, Monster.com, and other publications. Stacey did earn her MBA from Pepperdine University, and she's an adjunct professor at Phillips Graduate University, the former president of the Los Angeles chapter of the National Association of African Americans in Human Resources, and manages programs for professionals at Human Resources Association. She's the author of the book titled The Successful Interview, 99 Questions to Ask and Answer, and Some You Shouldn't, and 4 LinkedIn e-learning courses titled Recruiting for Diversity, Awareness of Conscious Bias, Making a Career Change, and Writing a Resume, which collectively are well on their way to 1 million views. So Stacey, we're so thrilled to have Stacey today, and with that, I am going to turn this webinar over to Stacey.
Hello, thank you, Nadia. I appreciate that introduction. So today we are going to talk about unconscious bias, and since Nadia so graciously read my bio, all the information is there. But something I realized that is not in my bio that used to be there, and I kind of took it out. You know how it is when you're updating. And I'm actually one of the early founders of the professional chapters for NAMBA, and I am the founder of the Los Angeles professional chapter, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. So very pleased to have been a longtime supporter of the National Association of Women MBAs, and was actually previously the executive director for about a year. It was also fun. So moving on, want to kind of go through the program today, and I always, put a little plug in about things that our clients say about us, because we really do good work, and people ask all the time, why do we do what we do? Especially when I go over the material that we're going to go over today, you're going to ask yourself as well, like, why do you do this, Stacey? So, obviously, as you know, the current climate that we're in, there's a Me Too movement that's happening, and obviously it's brought the awareness of sexual harassment in the workplace, right? But there isn't a woman alive who wasn't already keenly aware that sexual harassment was a problem. This was only a surprise to men. And the culture of an organization is at the very heart of the problems that most companies have problems facing. They have a hard time facing them because the face of the problem is sometimes the CEO, or at least the top leadership. And this is a hard truth. But when employees are scared to go to HR with their concerns, and when you're having these kinds of things happening within the organization, you really have to ask yourself why that is. And this all ties in together. When it comes to diversity strategies, in the same way that women weren't surprised by the Me Too movement, people of color are not surprised that there's a need for better diversity strategies at work. I'm going to quote from McKinsey throughout this presentation today, but I will tell you, every time I see another report from McKinsey, I roll my eyes just a little bit, because I go, wow, you really had to spend millions of dollars in time and research to come up with something I could have told you if you had just asked me. So the problem is that we usually have not asked the very people that we are attempting to help how it is that we can help them. And a perfect example of that is Starbucks, right? They just did this training, this grand gesture, and we all know that it was probably more for PR than it was to actually help their employees. Now, I know they think that it was to help their employees, but you'll see some statistics in a moment that really align with this entire Starbucks issue. So there's been a lot of change, right? If you think about the fact that diversity issues, started with affirmative action, there's been so much that's been going on, and yet here we are in 2018 still having the same conversation. Because who has affirmative action policies actually helped? If you look at the fact that it's really been a straight line, unfortunately, for women of color. And I'm going to focus on women of color in this particular piece because we are a women's organization, and that's who our audience is mainly today. So I'm going to focus there, but this does take into account also professionals of color, really. But we've done these programs, we've done training, we've done awareness campaigns, we've done all kinds of things. And for women of color, it really hasn't changed much. Now, of course, it's not a complete flat line, but for all intents and purposes, it is, right? 2 leave, 2 come in, 5 leave, 4 come in, 6 leave, 3 come in. It's a slight up and down, but across the line, it's flat. And so really, what affirmative action programs and diversity training have done, it has helped and benefited white women. And that's just a fact. There are so many stats to show that. I didn't even include them all here because you could just Google it and find there are so many. And so this is an interesting issue, right? If you think about the fact that we started these diversity programs and the plan was to help women, but also to help people of color, why have only white women benefited from this? So perfect example of that is equal pay, right? We've all seen the campaigns. We know that everyone knows the 77 cents on the dollar number. Sometimes it's 78 cents, they'll quote it as. But we always talk about the fact that women won't earn 77 cents on the dollar, and that's the number that we talk about. We even have equal pay day in April. That's because that represents the point at which a woman has to work into the next year in order to earn the same amount of money as their male counterpart. But again, that number only takes into account white women. So equal pay day isn't even equal for all women, right? It's pretty funny. It's actually kind of sad. But if you look at, for African American women and for Hispanic women, they are making far less than white women, but also than white men, obviously. And the largest pay disparity is actually between white women and Black women. That number, that disparity is actually increasing right now, which is scary. So we're also not equal in thought. And this is pretty interesting because when you think about the fact, we talk about all of the things that we have to do. And again, we're talking about all these programs and the things that are being put in place. We are not really getting down to the nitty gritty, right? This quote was interesting because this came from the Women in the Workplace report that was done in 2017 by McKinsey in conjunction with Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In organization. And so they actually collected data from over 70,000 employees, more than 200 companies, and they took that data and came up with this. They found that almost half of men think that women are well represented in leadership in organizations where only 1 in 10 senior leaders are women. So men are like, hey, there's one of you. You should be cool. And if you think about the fact that that one woman is more than likely a white woman, where does that leave everyone else? Where does that leave me, right? Like, let's be selfish for a moment. If I even think about myself, about my children, what does this mean for their future and their outlook, right? So the other thing that's interesting that came out of that study is that more than 60% of men said that their company is doing what it takes to improve gender diversity. More than 60%. But less than 50% of women agreed. Now, that's not a surprise either, right? Because we all look around and go, yeah, you're really not doing the things that you say you're doing. So these numbers definitely show that some men might not fully realize that a problem exists. But I'm pretty sure this also shows that some women don't realize a problem exists. And that's part of what we want to talk about today in forming allies and really realizing that many times when we say women, we have to ask ourselves, do we really mean all women? So I thought it was interesting that there's an organization called Atlassian, and they're a huge tech company out of Australia, but they also have an office in San Francisco, and they are affected by the diversity and inclusion in technology discussion. And so they conducted a diversity and inclusion survey, and they found that 80% of their respondents agreed that diversity and inclusion is important. That's good, right? You see that 77% say, D&I is important to my company, that D&I is important to employees, it's even a higher number, and that D&I is important to executives, slightly lower number, but everyone thinks D&I is important. So that's great. Again, if this is true, why aren't things changing? What is going on? So flipping back to the Women in the Workplace report from last year, these stats are really funny because when you talk about the level of commitment, the company has a much higher opinion than their employees about their priorities. And so that's where I think back to the Starbucks example, that here's an organization that thinks they're doing a really good thing, right? They want to show that they've got this level of commitment. But I am pretty sure that if you ask the employees if they thought that that training was, one, necessary, and two, would be effective, you would have had very few employees that would have actually agreed with both of those statements. But nobody did ask them, right? Nobody asked. The CEO said, hey, we're going to do this. And the CEO's lost his job. He's stepped down. He doesn't even work there anymore. So if you hadn't noticed that little tidbit, but CEO is out after that training. So what do we learn from that? What some people, unfortunately, have learned from that is that, okay, you have a problem, and we're going to not do training because that's not the right thing to do, right? That's what they've learned. I'm not saying it's correct, but that's what they hear now. And so many times these companies do these large sweeping measures without any thought to how it's actually going to affect their company and also to the ripple effects that it then creates throughout industry. Because when companies like Google, Facebook, Starbucks make a change or do anything, everyone follows because we're like sheep. It's like, oh, if Deloitte's doing that, we need to do it too. And so really my point today is I want to remind everyone that there are individual things that we can do and that we have to start thinking more customized. We have to start looking at our organization as an individual organization and then looking at its specific peculiarities and how we can make change within our organization that's specific to us versus making change that we think we need to implement because that's what everybody else is doing. Excuse me. So we're also not equal in action, right? But I think we kind of got there when we knew that. And we're seeing that perspectives continue to be different. If you've seen from the stats I've showed, there is a major discrepancy between what companies think and what employees think, between what's actually happening and between what people think is happening, between what we think is helpful and what is actually helpful. And so if you go back to the Atlassian study, more than 40% of the respondents there believe that their company's inclusion of people from underrepresented groups needs no improvement. So do you see the discrepancy? On the one hand, you say, it's important. We really think this is important. But then on the other hand, you're saying, well, we don't actually think we need to make a change. So that means you think it's important, but you think you've done enough, right? All questions to ask. So there's a really big discrepancy between belief and between action. Also between the studies and results, right? It just shows that really what's not important are the studies and the questions that we're asking. What's really important is the results that we are seeing across the board, which is really that everyone is frustrated. We're frustrated with this conversation. We're frustrated with talking about unconscious bias. We're frustrated with talking about diversity. And people really just want to go to work and work. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we do that? How do we actually make that happen? So I am going to go into a quick definition. And if you look at bias and discrimination, right, you have that bias is really more the thought, and discrimination is the act. So the issue that we have in this conversation is diversity fatigue is setting in. Why is that? Because the language of diversity makes people uncomfortable. Words like discrimination, oppression, dominance, subordination, heterosexism, racism, intersectionality, microaggressions, and definitely privilege. All of these words cause negative reactions. When people speak these words, others immediately focus on what it means for them, and it's easier for them to get defensive and argue the meaning than to actually learn how the language of diversity affects others and impacts all aspects of our lives. It's also easy to confuse the language. And so we have to improve communication. If we can't talk productively about something, then we're not going to be able to do anything about it. And unfortunately, right now, we seem to be in a place in society where we cannot have a conversation. As soon as somebody makes a comment, someone else is ready to jump down their throat, rather than allow them the opportunity to get their point across and to have, professional discourse about what that person's point is and what they're trying to say and what they're actually trying to communicate. What you'll find is that at work, you're much more likely to encounter bias than discrimination. Unfortunately, bias leads to discrimination, but this isn't a discrimination workshop, right? So bias isn't all about race and ethnicity or gender, right? Baby-faced people, where you're from, what your accent is. These are all stereotypes that are attached to some forms of bias, and others are just shortcuts to discrimination based upon features that are considered more or less desirable in society. So if you consider this, less than 15% of American men are over 6 foot tall, yet almost 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 foot tall. Does that make any sense? 15% of men are over 6 feet tall, but corporate CEOs, 60% of them are. So the reason for this is that, clearly when we go out to conduct a CEO search, no one's sending out the message saying, hey, get us a tall guy, right? But there's a bias that we have for a leader who is tall and slim and handsome. That is a bias that we have because that is what we have known leaders to look like. And so that's what we continue to expect leaders to look like. And when a leader looks different, it is very difficult for us to say, oh, this short, bald guy could also be a really good leader, because all we have been inundated with are images and past experiences of leaders who were tall. So that's what starts to happen. And it may seem unfair, but it's absurd, right, to choose a CEO because of height. But just like it's unfair and absurd to give employees a lower performance evaluation solely because they're overweight, or to prescribe a medical procedure to people more often because of their race, or to treat the same people different ways because of their clothing, right? Or even to call them boys more often than girls when they raise their hands in school. But yet all of these things continuously happen, and they're but a small sampling of the hundreds of ways that we make decisions every day in favor of one group and to the detriment of others without even realizing that we're doing it. So I thought this would be a great time to show a video from a woman who experienced bias. And this is a really great way to talk about the fact that many times when we talk about bias, even as you look at the screen, you know, you think, oh, well, it's men being biased against women. But we as women do this as well. And it is our jobs to first begin to change our own behavior before we can even start to impact anyone else's. So I hope you can all hear this. It's going to take a second to start.
Okay, so let me just get this out there. I have a bias against women leaders. No one could be more surprised about this than me. I'm a woman leader. And on top, I even work in human resources, which means it's kind of my job to be unbiased. In fact, I passionately encourage women to step into leadership. My poor kids would definitely tell you I never thought about that. But in spite of my strong belief that women make great leaders, I realized don't always act like it. Not long ago, within the same week, 2 members of my team asked me to take a look at their compensation. My first reaction to the man's request was something like, yeah, I'll look into it. My first reaction to the woman's request was something like, sure you're good. A day or so later, I'm sitting at my desk, hard at work, and I somehow connected what, up until then, I'd seen as 2 separate events. I had 2 very different reactions to basically the same request, and I thought, oh, what's up with that? Might I be biased and not even know it?
That's a really great clip because it shows the ways in which we can inadvertently be biased, right? Immediately to the guy, she's like, oh yeah, sure, I'll help you get more money. And to the woman, she's like, ah, you're probably good, right? Immediately put a stop to that woman's request. Now, maybe she went and looked into it, you know, who knows what she then did. But if you think about the fact, how many times do we do that? How many times do we immediately stop progress for somebody? I'll actually give an example from my own career. It was many years ago. I worked for a company, and I wanted to step into a different role. They were actually opening up some new positions and doing some new business development. And I was about to start working on my MBA, or I think I'd actually started working on my MBA. And I thought, oh, this would be great, I could utilize the experience. So I talked to my direct supervisor about it, and he was all for it. He said, yeah, you should go talk to the head of our department. Make an appointment. I go talk to the head of our department. And when I tell you that meeting didn't last 2 minutes, I would be exaggerating if I said it lasted longer than 2 minutes. I went in, I told her that I was interested in this position, and I wanted to see what I needed to do to, be considered, right? Wasn't even asking for that particular position right then. I was just saying, hey, it's something I want to work towards. Never even really finished what I was saying before she said to me, oh, well, that position requires a lot of travel and you've got small kids. And as she's saying this to me, she has her hands on my back and she's kind of like walking me out of her office. And that very moment I said, oh, I'm leaving this company. And so I didn't leave the next day, but I was definitely I was done. I immediately stopped putting my all into my work. I would come in late. I would do whatever the heck I felt like. I would, she had just turned me into a disengaged employee. So very interesting, very important for us as women to think about how we ourselves react to other women that come to us. Because again, we always assume, oh, it's men doing this. But we don't think about the way that we as women have impact, and sometimes more impact, because a woman will come to you expecting that you understand. So this should make sense. You know where I'm coming from. And so sometimes it's even more hurtful when it's a woman that is turning you down. So there is definitely some areas within your organization for you to review. And these are 3 areas, very broad. They're vast. And you might think at first that you don't have any responsibility in any of these areas, so how can you be an ally? But that's where you'd be wrong. So let's look at each step. You know, in recruiting, you can refer or go one step further and recommend, right? So you might not have responsibility right now to actually recruit, but if you don't, you can definitely refer and recommend. And I know it's hard for us to do that because we feel like we're putting our reputation on the line, but be honest and say that to the person. Let them know what's at stake, and then help them to be prepared so that you can recommend them. If somebody comes to you and you're not able to recommend them today, help them to do the things that they need to do to prepare so that you can recommend them tomorrow, right? And if you are in a position currently where you are recruiting, then you definitely need to be looking at this and making sure that you're thinking about how your company sources and hires. Where do you go? What are the avenues of bringing in candidates? On the leadership side, you know, how do people within your organization manage employees? And again, look at your own team. If you see something, say something. If there aren't enough women on the team, you don't have to be managing the team or be the project lead, but you can still say, hey, I'm a part of this team and I'm the only woman. Or there's only 2 women in a team of 20, whatever that is, right? Speak up. If there aren't enough people of color, question that. Where are they? Let's start looking. Does your employer hire people with a disability? Do you even know what the process might be? What jobs are available? You know, is the pay equal within your organization, right? Are you asking about your compensation? And if you have members, if you manage members of the team, are you advocating for appropriate compensation for those people on your team? I think those are all areas that we can begin to make some change. And especially in diversity and inclusion, you know, like I just talked about, being engaged. It's not always about, you know, I'm a Black woman and I want to be, you know, treated as such or recognized as such. I'm just a person who wants to come to work and wants to enjoy what I do. And I want to be engaged with a company that actually wants me to be there. So if your company has a retention problem, something like the example I just experienced or I just explained could be what's happening, right? I don't know why that particular woman said what she said to me, but I'm assuming at the time it was because I was a woman. I never at the time thought about, oh, it's because I'm Black, right? That didn't come into my mind. And so it's not always about race or ethnicity. It's, as I said earlier, sometimes it is about there's other things that happen. I actually recall too having an overweight colleague, and some of our coworkers, you know, they would snicker about her behind her back, and they would say things, and they were just really not very nice, right? And it made me think, you know, at the time I was very young, and I really didn't do anything about it, and she eventually left. I didn't work with her for that long. But it just made me think, like, you know, what could I have done differently? How can we be better to one another within our organization? And so maybe it's taking your coworkers aside and saying, hey, you know what? That behavior really isn't very cool. And just stopping that behavior. So we have to be able to be better leaders within our organization and be better examples. And it doesn't require you actually leading a team or managing a team in order for you to exhibit leadership skills. One of those other things too, in terms of, you know, diversity is, are you participating in your ERG group within your organization? You know, most larger companies have employee resource groups, and not just the women's one, right? Are you being an ally to the LGBT group? Are you joining in with group for the disabled? Do you include women of color in your circle, right? Or is it the same 3 or 4 women that always go to lunch together and excludes everyone else? Do you invite new people in? I have a good friend who refuses to participate on a panel if the panel isn't diverse. She always asks, she's like, that's great that you included me. I'm honored to be there. Are you planning to include any women of color? Asian, Hispanic, Native American, Black, anything? And she actually got booted off a panel recently because of that. They ended up replacing her with a woman of color. But she was like, that's fine. I'm okay with that. She's like, I get asked to be on panels all the time. I'm trying to get them to do the right thing. So sometimes you have to take a stand and you have to be willing to do that. So moving forward with these 3 areas, we talked about, here are some opportunities and some ways that you can actually begin to make change. So again, what does your hiring cycle look like? Even if you're not the one that's managing that hiring cycle, you're the coworker of the eventual person that's going to get that job. Talk to your manager and ask, hey, have you thought about interviewing, such and such who may be internal, who's interested, or I have candidates that I'd like to bring in. And rather than stopping at the first 3 people that come to mind, which are probably going to be 3 people who are very much like yourself, dig a little deeper and really think about who could I recommend for this opening that would be a good fit for this, who might not be the usual suspects, right? How can I go a little bit further into my LinkedIn profile? In fact, I used to include a slide when I would do a presentation like this on unconscious bias, because I would show that you really have to be intentional, because it is an innate thing that if you don't pay attention to, you automatically continue to want to be around people who look and think and act like you. That's just how we are as people. There's nothing you can do about that. It's not wrong, it just is. And so I looked at my LinkedIn connections one day, and back when LinkedIn used to structure it differently, and they would give you these little tiles of photos of people. And I remember scrolling through all of my connections and seeing that most of them were women, many of them were Black, but what really hit me was that I had almost 0 people in my network at the time that were Asian. This was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And I really thought about that, and I said, oh my goodness, how crazy is that? There's no Asian people in my network. And so I had to be deliberate about going out and networking in different areas. So I called up my friend who is Asian, and I said, hey, where do you network? And she's like, oh, I'm part of the National Association of Asian Americans. And, she started telling me about all these different groups, APEX and Asian Business Association. And I said, oh, great. Next time you're going out networking, call me. I'll come with you. And she started sending me invitations to different networks and things that she was involved in. And that's how I started to change my network. I had to be intentional about it. It doesn't just happen by accident. No one's going to knock on your door and go, hey, I hear you need to be more diverse. I'd like to be your friend, right? That just doesn't happen. We have to be better about what it is that we're doing, and it requires action on our part. Part of hiring is also, we go back to compensation, because compensation is a really big thing. And one of the things that you can do is to aim for as close to a no negotiation compensation policy as you can get. Because studies show that men negotiate more often than women, and that when women negotiate, they're actually punished for that. So if we can work to remove the negotiation out of compensation, that will help, because then if you say this role requires this type of compensation, then it doesn't matter who eventually gets the job. That's the compensation that they get. And you also want to ensure, as I mentioned, that underrepresented employees are included in your interviews. You also don't want to overload them, though, right? Because I just saw this video from this engineer from Google, and he was saying that he was one of only 3 Black people in his department of 400. So does that mean that every time that they have interviews, they're going to keep calling him in so that he can talk to the prospective candidates? If he did that, that would be all he would be doing. He'd never get his job done, and that's really burdensome. So you don't want to do that, but maybe there's a way to have that employee do a video, right, and talk about what it's like to work within the organization, and that video can be circulated. So ways to be able to show that you are trying to increase diversity while not being a burden to the few diverse candidates that you do have within the organization. Moving on to leadership. Again, as I mentioned before, leadership doesn't mean that you actually have to be managing employees right now. It just means that you need to exhibit leadership skills. But as a leader who is managing employees, you do have to remember that people want to work for good managers, right? They want proper work distribution, and they want trust. Trust includes offering flexible time off. Trust your employees to get their work done. Not everyone can be at work 9 to 5 all the time, or 9 to 6. So if you've got kids, sometimes we've got aging family members, sick family members. We've got different things going on within our families that require us to need those flexible work arrangements. And as managers, we have got to be able to trust our employees, because if you don't trust your employee, why did you hire them? I think also fair treatment is something that, again, it's not necessarily just a leadership skill, that's just across the board. Everyone wants to come to work and feel that they have equal opportunity to get to that next level, or to get onto that next project, or to be a part of things that are happening within the organization. And that's what happens if you don't feel that. That's where the disengagement comes in. Excuse me. I think also another really big thing that's important, and I see this all the time, is dish duty. It sounds so petty and so silly until you're the person that always gets stuck doing the dishes. And then it's not. So within your organization, if you're not in a huge company where somebody comes in and takes care of the kitchen, and even if you are in a huge company, usually there's still rules of etiquette, right? You put a dish in a sink, you rinse it and put it in the dishwasher, or you just wash it out, or whatever. It shouldn't fall to the same 1 or 2 people to always be taking care of the kitchen. It's a very frustrating thing, and I see it a lot where we do that, and that is one of the biggest complaints that people have, is like they come to work. I mean, who wants to come to work and get treated like the maid, right? Nobody wants that. So then you also have the opportunity, as I mentioned, as part of diversity and inclusion, is engaging your workforce. Belonging, we all hear about that now. That's very important. It's high on the radar. You really want your employees to feel that they belong. So here's another silly, nitpicky thing. Check the temperature of your office. The temperature in most buildings defaults to what's most comfortable for men. But if you walk around the office and you see that so many people have on bulky sweaters in the middle of the summer, or are sitting there with blankets, or wearing gloves, it's probably time to change the temperature of your office. It's a silly thing, but it makes a huge difference to probably half of your workforce, because at this point, women are about half of the workforce. So it's really something that we just don't think about, but go a long way towards engaging your employees. Because I know for me, I can't work when I'm cold. I literally I can't get creative. I'm frustrated. I start to get angry. I'm just annoyed. And then I'm complaining the entire time about how cold it is. Simple things like that help to engage your workforce. I mentioned employee resource groups. Not every company has them, but maybe your company is big enough to where you need to start one. It's a good idea to look at what are those initiatives and things that you can do within your workforce to help to be a better ally, not only to other women, but also to other dimensions of diversity within your workforce. So I think I'm going to stop there and say that this is something we can do as women. We can pull together and we can definitely do this together because we're women and we rock, and we usually have the tools and the tactics to make it work. And so I'm very confident that if we start to think about things through a slightly different lens, that as we move forward, we will start to see some change. So I'll leave it to you, Nadia, to see if there are questions.
Great. Thank you, Stacey. We did have a couple of questions, basically centering around how to be an ally for women of color specifically. Any specific examples that you have, where women have been able to be a good ally to you? And then furthermore, how to get more training on unconscious bias, how to be able to step outside of themselves and just become more aware of the biases that they do have that they may not know about.
Sure. So addressing the first one, I will say, using my friend Vicky as an example, I met her many years ago now, and she is a kick-butt lawyer. She's really great, and she's one of those women who she is always looking to help everyone, right? So it's not just about, she's very much about women. Like, she's probably the person who, back in the day was burning her bra, et cetera, right? But she always makes sure that when she walks into a room, she says hello to everyone. And so, again, this isn't about being an ally, I would say, even just for women of color. This is about being respectful and open to everyone. So as an example, every time I would, I do a lot of speaking engagements, and I remember going to this event where I was not a speaker, but I was going because I really wanted to hear from these speakers who, of course, happened to be, white males, because it was a tech event. And so I get to this event, we're at the YouTube space, and the 4 speakers who were going to be up for the day are together in a corner, just having this rousing conversation, right? And so I look around and I see all the attendees are talking to each other, and I just see that the 4 speakers are just standing there chit-chatting with each other. And so I walk up to them, I waited for a moment, and then I finally said, "Hi, I'm Stacey, and you are," and I introduced myself. And it was hilarious because the look of shock on their face was like, who is this woman that just walked up and interrupted our conversation? And I kind of very pointedly said to them, I said, "Oh, it's so great that you guys are the speakers for this event." I was like, don't you think it would be great for you to mix and mingle with the attendees? And again, they had this look like, why would I do that? And so I say that because, again, so many times we walk into situations where and when I say we in this instance, I'll say as a Black woman, so I'll even say I walk into situations where I might be the only Black person in the room, right? And there's always this moment of kind of, I don't know what the word is, where people kind of look at you and it almost has this question of, why is she here? Now, granted, it doesn't happen as much in LA. I live in Los Angeles, and it doesn't happen as much anymore. But 10 years ago, oh my goodness, it was crazy. And so where I'm going with this is to say that what you can do is welcome everyone into the room, right? It doesn't have to be just the Black woman that walks in or just the Hispanic woman that walks in, but really be more intentional about being open and talking to not just your usual clique of people, but the new people, and asking, hey, do you need anything? hey, thanks for coming to this event. Do you know where the restrooms are? Have you had a drink? Let me introduce you to so-and-so. They're a new employee, showing them around, showing them like, hey, this is the guy that can help you if you ever have IT issues. This is the person that's really good, runs down and gets us Starbucks every now and then. If you're really nice to her, she'll bring you one. Just getting people into that sense of belonging. And that's the piece that we miss a lot, is we all come in, we go to our silos, we do our own thing, head down, and we kind of ignore new people because we just, we're tired, we're busy, sometimes we're lazy, or sometimes we just don't notice, right? We're just not paying attention. And so it just goes back to what I was saying about being intentional.
Right. That's great.
Yeah. And then with regard to training, of course, I'll put in the plug. I would love for you all to take a look at my online course on LinkedIn online learning. Some of you probably already have access if you've ever looked at LinkedIn's online learning. If not, you can also access it through lynda.com, which is owned by LinkedIn, and it's lynda.com. And so there I have an unconscious bias course. There are other unconscious bias courses as well. There is also I'm going to mess this up. It's the IAT. And right now I'm completely drawing a blank on what it stands for, but it's the Harvard, it's like Institutional Assessment Test, I think, or something. But if you Google like Harvard IAT, it will pop up, and that is a test that kind of goes through. They have a number of different tests in there, actually, across the board for all kinds of different types of bias. And that's sort of the standard that's out there right now. So those are helpful for awareness, because again, I go back and I always keep saying, bias isn't bad. Bias just is, right? And so the only way for us to combat bias is by just being aware. And that's really all we can do. Just like when I go out sometimes, if I'm only in a crowd of all Black women, I'm going, oh, well, maybe I need to meet some new people. I need to step outside of this little clique that I'm in right now. And it takes practice to remember to do it, and then to actually do it.
And the final question is just about including, we have a couple of presidents on our call right now, and, reaching out to demographics that may not already be included in their NAMBA groups. What would you suggest is the best way to do that?
You're talking about just like including people, increasing membership, I guess, is what you're saying. Yeah. And reaching out to new folks. The way I always used to do it was I would go to other events, right? I would just always look for the other women's events, or for other events in general where there were a lot of women. So for example, human resources, there's a lot of women in human resources. And so I would go to a lot of HR events and meet people there and just invite them. Personal invitation always works. And just reminding them to come out. I think that's the main part, is that we don't do the outreach and then we don't do the follow-up. So, outreach one time probably won't be that successful, but, if you follow up a couple of times, I think it definitely works.
Great. Well, thank you, Stacey. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you so much to our participants for their time. As a reminder, Stacey's webinar will be in our members only section of the website. You can find that recording and you can share that recording there. So just reminder that is www.namba.org. And Stacey, do you have your contact information on a slide that you can put up real quick or share with the group?
I always forget to do that. I'm on LinkedIn. If you just type in Stacey A. Gordon into LinkedIn, I pop up. Or if you go to reworkwork.com, you can always shoot me an email through the contact us. It goes straight to my assistant, and she will forward all emails.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time again, Stacey. We appreciate you.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be able to participate.
Well, with that, we are going to conclude our webinar, and we look forward to seeing you all in the next one. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.